welcome to the Heretic Hammer podcast. I'm your host, Marshall. This is my co-host, Dylan.
Hello.
And we are now 13 episodes in, and we finally broke. It's happened.
Lucky number.
We're here on the 2 list. We made it so far. Some would say this is because I need to do extra preparations. Others would say I have weird OCD tendencies and I want all of my Imperial-based episodes to be on even numbers. Who's to say? Me, but...
I was going to say, it's you, I think.
Yeah. But
it's definitely not me. I think it's you.
So here we are. I wanted to get to... We will, at some point, we're also going to do another break between lore episodes to do the first hobby episode. I would like to do that. From a discussion we had off camera, not to the extent that we had it. It was a little more memey, but it gave me the thought other than otherwise. So we'll do the hobby episode at some point, kind of between at some point, but that will be that'll be when kind of I think there's a good period to do so. And I want to get a few extra, at least especially like big player factions in there. But other than that, today, this tier list, you may be wondering, what is it about? And that is going to be on the video games of Warhammer 40k. What is good? What's bad? What's okay? And then, should I go for this or should I just kind of skip it?
What is playable, I feel like, is also going to be a big one here.
Yeah. In a literal sense and a technical and a subjective sense. So the first thing I want to start off with, in this list that I had found and then kind of just I'm going to go off of, is a number of Necromunda games. And that is part of the reason. And so these are going to kind of go into the haven't played / just kind of NA category here at the bottom. I'll show it now, so at least you see them. So there's one Necromunda game, which was kind of like when they looked at the trailer, it's like a kind of like objective, almost kind of like Overwatchy kind of game. It's third person, and then Hired Gun is a first person kind of boomer shootery game, and it seems to review decently well, but I've never been into Necromunda. Necromunda is like 40k, but a specific hive world called Necromunda. Okay. And it has its own game and universe or like theme. But it's just not something I've delved into. So I wouldn't be able to really give a good justification. Like, is this a good Necromunda game? I wouldn't really know. Is it a good game? Seemingly Hired Gun is okay. The other one, not so much. And then Lost Crusade was one where like I kind of tried looking it up. I wasn't getting good showcasings for it. So I'm just kind of letting it go. I just had no clue about it. And there's enough games on this list. I just wasn't going to get into it. There was a couple of games on this list that I haven't played, but I know are terrible or just like very much not worth our time. And that's what we're going to start off with on Warhammer 40k Regicide. Do you like chess?
That is a more complex question than you would expect it to be.
Well, it's just a 40k reskin of chess, which sounds great, but out of a list of games that I would recommend to people to get into 40k, this isn't really on it, especially when this is a podcast about getting into the hobby through the series lore. So it's going to have to be a big skip, and I'm just going to throw it in the heresy tier.
It sounds like it would be like the opposite of what we're trying to do with our show. Like it'd be more so for someone who is into 40k already, but is trying to get into chess.
Yes, I would say exactly that. Yeah, I think that's exactly the case.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so the few games on here are pretty old, one of which for sure is going to be Fire Warrior. And I wanted to talk about it because I'm not obviously, as we noted in the Tau episode, right? I'm not a blind Tau hater, right? And I actually like the Tau very much. And unfortunately, I would like to know that if you really, really like, if Tau is your favorite, then maybe this game is like worth the play, if it's on the Steam summer sale or, if it's on a flash sale or whatever. But it's not a good game. It's good for people who played it new, in the early 2000s, because it's a first-person shooter. You're playing as a Tau Fire Warrior, but it's a classic 2000s FPS, right? So it's just kind of go through, shoot things. It kind of fits with Tau lore, but it's also older Tau lore, so very much a mix. Also questionable accents because it was Tau in the early 2000s. But it's one of those things where it could potentially be a good and bad kind of game, where it's like you might like its oldness and therefore it might be a fun romp. You're purposely playing a bad game for the fun of it. But, I'd only experiment if you like really, you just really want to be a fire warrior.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to throw it into disappointing because it's just kind of, whatever. It's not okay. It's still bad, but it's not so bad that it's unplayable, right? It's just not aged well.
Sure.
However, another older game that we maybe is a little bit more recommendable is Armageddon. It's kind of like a classic Command and Conquer style. It's also in the graphical quality of the earliest Command and Conquer and maybe Age of Empires. So kind of like one of the earliest, RTS kind of games, but a lot of people still feel that it holds up as long as you're, willing to kind of live with the older graphics, because that today could be a turnoff for a number of people, right? But if you're into that old style, especially people our age, where maybe they actually were willing to play that. I have to change this, by the way. I did forget this because I made this so that it was a little easier to, then like if you're our age and you're kind of into it, then like you can do so. So I put it into the worth playing. The top down, full 2D point and click kind of, first gen AoE Command and Conquer gameplay style doesn't fit everyone's scheme nowadays. I can't put it really high, but it's for sure worth the look at if you like that.
I don't have a ton of experience with RTSs. It was never like my favorite genre. I think far and away the RTS that I played the most was StarCraft. I played a ton of it when I was in high school. But it's honestly been several years since I really dug into it, and it's a genre that I don't really spend a lot of time in. Like I've never touched Command and Conquer or whatchamacallit,
Age of
Empires. Yeah. They've definitely been really big blind spots for me in terms of video gaming.
Right. And we'll obviously get to another one soon enough. Because there's a few RTS games in the Warhammer 40k video game history books that definitely got some popularity. The game that originally was an old one, but we're going to talk about like the most current iteration, which is technically like from 2016, which is Space Hulk Tactics.
Space Hulk.
Yeah. So the fun thing about Space Hulk is it's one of those things where like, if you just hear like Space Hulk or whatever, you might get like confused if it is a 40k thing or not. And that's because part of the reason is that it stems from a different board game that they made based on the 40k universe, but it was for the board game Space Hulk, which was a game where essentially like you would go through the board a piece by piece, because you are essentially being, these Terminator unit Space Marines, but going through the tight corridors that Space Hulks can have. Because, Space Hulks are massive ships, right? They are almost, entire cities and, in some ways states in space. But they are very much characterized by a number of their corridors being very tight. So they'll have like very tight hallways leading into large room, tight hallways into large room, or something like that. So that's a big thing, is that the board game was centered around like you would move forward on the board, uncovering the board layout small steps at a time. And the video game went to reflect that. And the early ones were decently regarded when they came out. They didn't age as well. But if you wanted to play that type of thing, but in more of an updated format, the 2016 version is, especially with like according to reviews, not the worst way to do it. It's definitely not the most polished experience, for sure. It has plenty of its own like moderate issues and stuff like that. And it can be essentially, as far as I'd seen, like kind of basic and gets repetitive, but it's otherwise just kind of like plays like a very simple tactical turn-based game, but just with like a very confined board space. But the whole premise of the game is you're a set of Blood Angel Terminators, and you're going through this Space Hulk, just trying to go through and fight Tyranids, many of which specifically Gene Stealers. Essentially types of Tyranids, because we haven't gotten to them yet. They're types of Tyranids that effectively try to find biomaterial that they can use to adapt themselves and give themselves new gene traits. But overall, the game itself, like I said, is still decent. It's potentially worth playing, but it can get kind of stale and boring after a bit. So it may not be worth playing, especially for a full amount. So honestly, we'll just kind of put it in the okay.
Okay.
But it's not terrible by any means. It's just, mid.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not mid. And we're going to get into a bit of a sequence here. And that is going to be the Dawn of War games.
Dawn of War.
We're going to just talk first about Dawn of War 1 and its expansions. And the thing is, I wanted to rank the expansions separately, as they all have relatively and various different feels and gameplay, and especially the single player experience. So a little bit maybe in the multiplayer, but for the large part, even in their single player experience, they all have a different feel and ways that they kind of go from main game to expansion. So starting with the main Dawn of War itself, it still holds up personally as a great RTS. Obviously Windows XP graphics can only age so well, but much like Armageddon, you can, if you're able to kind of push yourself past the graphics, and and sometimes you may have to use something like a simple like camera zoom out mod, or like, which is a very simple thing to do, and ways to maybe like make the fog of war a little bit more easier to work with. Again, just very simple, like drop in a file mod. It'll play much nicer on modern hardware. However, the story of the single player from the first one is very much still worth playing today. And I mean, just from especially its historical impact, because you remember you mentioned that you had played StarCraft.
Yeah.
Well, did you know, allegedly, that StarCraft was supposed to be Dawn of War?
Oh.
You ever think about how those Zerg look? You then look up a Tyranid and think those might look kind of similar? Or that StarCraft Marine looks a little Space Marine-y?
I mean, to be clear, there's always been that kind of thing between Blizzard and Games Workshop, where it's like, hey, I think somebody copied somebody else's homework here, because that's present in a lot of the Warcraft stuff as well.
Yes. Well, unfortunately for Blizzard, Warhammer and subsequently Warhammer 40k have existed a lot earlier than Blizzard even existed as a company. So,
correct. Yes.
It's relatively clear who copied whose homework. But yes, that was the thing, was that they were supposedly going to be making the Dawn of War games, or essentially the Warhammer 40k RTS. Something went wrong, and they decided, well, we're going to then do our own thing. And Dawn of War on itself then got made by Relic, and they, on the way there, they knocked it out of the park. And I mean, just from every aspect of what it is, it just has to go into God Emperor tier. I mean, it represents everything that it became. I mean, it's just,
even after all this time.
Yeah. I mean, from an RTS, you can get it so that you can get these large battle experiences. It still plays to a really nice degree where if you want to go into skirmish and stuff like that, you can set your parameters to really affect the difficulty. It is a great mod platform, so you can update it in whatever ways you want, or like customize it to as many degrees. Like I just learned into how to set the campaign to have custom like faction skins in it.
Ooh, cool.
But the story itself, especially in the first one, is also just very entertaining. It's a great Warhammer story. You get to go through seeing the Space Marines deal with orcs, deal with Eldar, and deal with Chaos Space Marines. You get a great battle between Eliphas and the leaders of the Blood Ravens Space Marines.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, it is still inherently a great package on its own. However, someone could kind of sit into it. I will put Winter Assault in the amazing tier because it still holds a great single player experience and all that. It adds the Imperial Guard, who play very much like the Imperial Guard should. But I bring it down just a little bit because I don't think the campaign hits as good story-wise. And it doesn't necessarily like have amazing requirement to especially to go to Dawn of War 2, for example. But it's great for adding the Imperial Guard, and it's and having a campaign where you can be the Imperial Guard has its endearing human factor. But I think all in all, it's probably not as, if you wanted to skip it, you could. And then unfortunately, the next one will also go into the amazing tier because while it's still great, it gets outshined by the one that comes after it.
Okay.
And that's the Dark Crusade. The single player campaign for Dark Crusade, first of all, the game added Necrons. That was the new race for this one. But then
cool.
The campaign was kind of like your Dynasty Warriors Empires style, where it was which this is the first type of single player for me that had that, so that's why I always go back to it. But it's essentially, instead of going through a singular story, you go through, essentially you pick which faction you want to be, so you get to choose any of the factions. This also did add Tau. I should actually denote that.
Noted.
Tau and Necrons, but you can choose between Space Marines, Guard, Tau, Necrons, Chaos Space Marines, Eldar, and Orcs. And essentially you are trying to conquer this single planet, and you have to get through all the territories to do so. And obviously when you get to the home base of every faction, there'll be one larger but tougher mission to beat in every one. But otherwise, the single player itself then feels like a good, it's like a repeated number of skirmish games, but by getting territory, you get better things. So, but like I said, it does get outshined by Soulstorm, and Soulstorm is by far my favorite out of all of them. If I did have to say one to play out of all four of the Dawn of War 1 set, I would just say get Soulstorm. The reason being is it's like Dark Crusade, where it's a territory based, takeover game, except this time it uses more area because it uses 4 planets as your board, and then it adds the Dark Eldar and the Sisters of Battle. So it has some of the most complete in terms of especially races of the time. The only one that's really missing that was available in the game at the time is Tyranids. Other than that, like, it has a very complete experience with what was available at the time for tabletop and factions. Mm-hmm. And it just feels more expansive than Dark Crusade. And it has the best mod, which is the unification mod, which adds even more races, not in the campaign, but in general. Allows for a modern online experience. And again, adds every race every faction into the game with some extra things that Games Workshop won't give us, but should, like Chaos Sisters of Battle. But other than that, it's by far my favorite in terms of Dawn of War 1. I think it's awesome. And it's very much like top tier Warhammer 40k game. But cool. Dawn of War 1 is great if you want to have like a linear campaign experience. If you don't want like that territory conquer thing. Mm-hmm. You just get less factions, which is the downside, but it's still inherently a classic. All right. So next, I think going over the Armada games, the Gothic Armada games is good. While they aren't necessarily my cup of tea, I think they're definitely a number of people, because a lot of people love, they love naval combat, and this is a space naval combat. So like if you liked Eve or World of Warships or stuff like that, these games are definitely suited for you. But definitely from what I know of, the first game is very much like, okay, it's decent and good, but it has like weird clunky things that just like weren't ironed out well. But that's where and again, this is where the subjectivity comes in. You very much could put it into amazing. I'm going to put it into worth playing, because again, they're just not my thing. But this is where the subjectivity is just coming in by all means. If you're really into these games, and I know a lot of people like them and they do get well rated, at least 2 did. Because it just ironed out everything. It just made everything smoother, better, and has more factions. So if you love spacefaring warfare, naval combat video games, it's slow. It is going to be, because it's the type of game it is. But if you're into it, by all means, it's definitely potentially in the amazing tier. But I will say it's worth playing. I'm not going to deny that it is a good game and it deserves to be high up on the list. So I would definitely say it's worth playing for sure. Someone in a similar category of games I haven't played personally, but I know are very well regarded, and I'm going purely on the reviews for this one, is Sanctus Reach. I'm going to put it in the worth playing, but I do know it's one of the things it gets very well regarded for is the fact that it is, a lot of people think of it as a great representation of the tabletop game in video game format.
Oh, interesting.
Which is great conceptually, although probably of the edition it was at the time, it probably is less so a good review for 10th edition now.
Sure.
But still, a lot of things are still comparable, right? There are many aspects of it. But there are other games I think that do that part better, even though maybe the gameplay isn't exactly the same, but you can get like the feel for it. But it is and it doesn't have great options, or it's not like crazy variety when it comes to factions. I mean, the original launch version very much focuses on space wolves versus orcs. And I mean, space wolves, not space marines. So it's like the one space marine faction too. So it is lacking in some options, but it was well reviewed and well looked at by the community. So I'll put it into worth playing, but it's one of many to look at in that regard.
Gotcha.
All right. Let's talk about the first mobile game. And I have to talk about Freeblade.
Yeah, mobile games.
Okay, so
we love talking about them.
All right. So in general, I will note most 40k mobile games are like card-based whatever games. Like they're either like a Magic clone, a Gwent clone, or like a new thing altogether, whatever. I'm not going to talk about those because they don't do much for the realm of lore. They don't do much to represent the tabletop. And they're essentially just card-based gacha games. That's kind of just what they are. And at least if it's going to have a gacha thing, I'd like it to maybe have some representation for the game other than just giving you a piece of lore on the card itself. If you're into those card-based games, they exist. You can pick from any of them because they're all going to be different. So from that point, just pick the one you like, but not going to rate them because I don't want to touch those. But Freeblade is a game where you play as an Imperial Knight, so a giant mech, traveling with a group of Dark Angels to bring the Emperor's justice and give recognition to your lost family name. And it plays as like an auto-scroll arcade shooter. So it's actually really nice because it helps it control, not confusing or like ass. Because like trying to like pilot a mech suit with a mole game sounds like it could easily be a nightmare. So it lets you use like your finger controls to like change what type of gun you're using. Like you can use two of your fingers and like slide down to your target to use a missile. You can just hold to use the Gatling gun. It has like cool aspects to it. It uses like quick time effects for like boss fights. So it's like, again, it's very like arcade mobile, and which on its own would be fine. And it's actually really fun on its own. But it's heresy. This game is heresy.
Oh.
All because this game does one of the greatest sins that I hate. I'm fine if a mobile game has microtransactions. I'm fine if a mobile game has like a subscription model. I'm fine if a mobile game maybe is free, but you have to watch ads, or it has ads in the game. I'm fine with any of those things individually. But a game that is going to potentially charge me $60 and then also have me watch a video ad after going through a mission? Heresy. You can't have both. It's a free game, I know, but you can't charge out the ass for microtransactions. $60 for a skin.
Oh, no.
And then make me watch an ad on top of it.
Oh, no.
No, I'm not for it. It can't happen. It's a game that is ruined. It's a great game that is ruined by a terrible policy. It sucks. I would put it in, it's disappointing in concept, but it's just total heresy. So there it goes. All right. Next, let's go into the year 2010. Let's talk about Space Marine because it's getting a sequel soon.
That's true.
Yeah. And, that's going to come out this fall. Me and you should definitely play it. I think it'd be a great time.
I would love to do that.
Because it has co-op. But the one thing about it is we got to kind of remember what third-person action shooter games were like in 2010. So for that matter, it's very solid, right? It's not bad in any way. Like bad.
How many shades of Gears of War is it?
Not many. No, it's not a Gears clone by any means for sure. But it's still like a generic third person shooter. So it does good to give you like the actual action gameplay is solid. Moving from being able to go from shooting to melee almost instantaneously is awesome. And like being like you can go from using your heavy gun, or one of your like more powerful weapons. Like you can use a plasma rifle, be blasting orcs, but then a bunch of orcs come at you. You can immediately use the other button, the melee button, to just start chopping down the orcs that are coming in, like that are just getting at you and just coming at you from all sides.
Nice.
And then go right back to shooting with the other action button. So it's like really quick and seamless. The main things that it suffers from is the story being decent but kind of lacking and very short. It has a decent like loop where maybe you can replay it and do different weapons at different times or whatever, or pick missions to do them differently. And the multiplayer was pretty fun, right? The multiplayer was actually a very good time, but yeah, it's like a 2010 story. So it's like very cookie cutter. We start by fighting the orcs, and then the Chaos Space Marines show up with their leader Memroth, which is only half of a joke name. His name is Nemeroth, Nemeroth. Okay. Gotcha. So he's just pretty much Memroth. That's kind of like the whole thing where it's just like, it's very cookie cutter. It's just like, and like between fights is literally just a bunch of running through rubble or hallways that have nothing in them, go to an elevator, go through a hallway, fight another set of enemies, go through hallway, go through elevator, fight orcs, fight enemies.
Rinse and repeat.
It gets moving, but especially with the sequel coming out, I will put it in maybe the lowest portion of worth playing. Like it would potentially actually be okay, but I think with the things that it had going for it, and I think actually there's probably going to be people who are going to be willing to play the multiplayer in hype for Space Marine 2, and that's actually a fun experience. So potentially worth playing, especially on sale, which goes on sale fairly regularly, so worth doing.
Including right now.
Yes.
Though, granted, this podcast will be coming out at a later date, so that may not still apply.
It will not be on right now when this comes out.
But I do, in fact, own this game. I just have not played it at all.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be worth playing, especially before Space Marine 2 comes out.
Yeah.
But next up, we're going to get back to Dawn of War. And so while Dawn of War 2, is still an RTS, it's an RTS, but with like a different methodology, like a different mindset. Right? Dawn of War 1 was about amassing a giant army, having to go against your opponent's giant army, and going through and collecting, doing the normal RTS stuff, right? Collect requisition points, collect whatever, or annihilate your enemy, right? 2 took more of a squad focus to it, and actually kind of feels a little bit closer to like what the tabletop game is supposed to be like. And this also added a Last Stand game mode, which they added as DLC for the 3rd expansion, but whatever. It was just a mode where essentially you got to do Hero Hammer. So you would pick like a Chaos Sorcerer, a Space Marine Champion, a Tyranid Hive Tyrant, a Orc War Boss. And this was in the main Dawn of War 2. They added more with Retribution. But, and then you would just fight waves of Tyranids as like a horde mode. But like you got to use all the hero abilities that like the hero characters from the main game had. So that was always like a cool, like I was actually really like that. But I did really like that. I know a lot of people, and that's the thing, a lot of people do prefer this gameplay style, myself actually included, because the smaller armies makes it more manageable, and you can make more tactical decisions because you're not like having against flood of just units. You're like actually picking units that have value and all that.
So I'm curious about, sorry to interrupt. I'm just curious about like the actual scale that we're talking about here, because you mentioned that it's like, it feels like more of a squad focus compared to the much larger, amount of units in the first Dawn of War game. So like, for example, in the first mission of Dawn of War 2, you have this smaller squad that you're leading, and you're kind of intercepting with another group of soldiers that is being sort of assaulted by orcs. I know this because I actually played the first mission of Dawn of War 2 between the last podcast and this one. And you're only really controlling a group of like 4 or 5 units altogether. It's like you say, it's not like a huge group of people. It's just like this small group of these Space Marines. So in the original Dawn of War, like how many units are you possibly controlling at a time?
Yeah, so there's obviously like a greater population buff aspect in the first Dawn of War. Like I'll have an image here for you. Obviously I have this playing in the trailer or video playing in the background, but like you can see here, even like there's a lot of Space Marine on the screen. There's 4 dreadnoughts. There's 5. There's actually 5 dreadnoughts. There's multiple Devastator squads. There's multiple tactical Marine, like basic squad units. And I mean, there are so many, but especially depending on like which army you're taking. So like, yeah, this scale got fairly significant where like, and the campaign and the single player versions of those games can get to that scale. Like you can get them to be quite large once you get through, the main mission. But then like, yeah, you'll get to Dawn of War 2 and you'll maybe like in firefights, it will maybe be like a couple squads fighting each other because the other thing is it actually has cover in the game too. So you'll maybe actually then be like using the squads in various directions, right? Because in first Dawn of War, they'll just kind of be anywhere. And then 2, you're actually like taking those squads, like half of the amount that would have been in 1, and just like, and then actually, and putting them in tactical positions. So yeah, my rough statement on it would be like roughly about like half as much in terms of size if you got like really late game.
Okay.
But that's where one thing kind of I will put is that the thing with Dawn of War 2 is Dawn of War 2 and Dawn of War 2 Chaos Rising are personally, I feel very equal. Like if you really like the chaos aspect that Dawn of War 2 brings, the potential to essentially kind of almost, you can't actually play in the single player as a Chaos Space Marine, but you can essentially let yourself be continually corrupted. And then the post cutscene will show you having joined the Black Legion. Or stay pious and stay true to the Emperor and, be the champion and all that. Dawn of War 2 is pretty much just your classic, like, Space Marines are trying to fight against a Tyranid invasion, which is a very difficult thing to do because they're such a swarm and they can block communication and make it very difficult. So, like I said, depending on kind of if you really are interested in which campaign, the campaigns themselves play very similar. But if you're not as into I feel like there are some people that may be slightly less into the chaos karma thing. So I'll put it in amazing, and I'll put the vanilla Dawn of War in God Emperor tier because, again, very much worth playing. Like, it is so good, especially the graphics hold up much nicer. It has a great online skirmish mod called Dawn of War 2 Codex Edition that technically is for Retribution, but that the 2 campaigns for Dawn of War 2 and Chaos Rising play very similar, where like each of your heroes are commanding a squad, so you can get a very good multiplayer feeling single player game. So it doesn't feel like it's just like 5 characters moving forward. It still feels like you have multiple squads going through the story. So it has like, and it has a good story on its own still, like, you know, to the same level as like Dawn of War and whatnot, the first one. However, Dawn of War 2 Retribution, one of my favorites to play now. However, I will put it in the amazing tier, not at the top level, because the downside about the single player is that it is a scenario where all of your heroes are not leading units. They're just the heroes. It's, you essentially pick when you go into a mission, do you want to play as the hero, have the hero in your squad, or or like a unit replacement? So like, for example, you'll either, you know, you'll have a tech marine, or you'll have a unit of tactical space marines, you know, or you'll have, you know, you'll have your apothecary, or you'll have a unit, or you'll have the jump pack lieutenant, or you'll have a unit of jump pack marines. So it's one of those things where it's like, it doesn't have the same feeling as the main campaign in the first 2 expansions, but it does let you play in the main campaign as more than as the other factions, which is the Astra Militarum, the Chaos Space Marines, Eldar, Orcs. And then, honestly, let me just put Dawn of War 3 in disappointing. They released the game. It only had...
Oh, there was a Dawn of War 3? I actually genuinely didn't hear about that.
This is a classic situation of an amazing trailer for not a great game.
Oh, no.
Yeah. It just... They tried doing like a middle ground between 1 and 2 in terms of army size. It played a lot like a MOBA in terms of the way the characters worked. It just didn't feel like Warhammer 40k. Like having your chapter master do a front backflip hammer slam while video gaming on its own and whatnot isn't very 40k in many ways. Despite that, maybe it could be, but it didn't feel right in that scenario. And just moreover, like, it just felt like it was lacking content. You know, because that's the thing, right? Like, you look at all the other Dawn of Wars, they had a Dawn of War and then sold multiple expansions. And granted, a lot of that is because that's just how games worked at the time. There wasn't DLC.
Certainly.
But every expansion felt like it built on the game still, right? This felt like they built the base game and then we're going to put the rest of the game with the expansions later. And people didn't like that. They were kind of done with that model. And people were getting sick of it, especially when the game wasn't going to be that great. And it didn't launch well either. It launched buggy, which was just the nail in the coffin.
The thing about Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2, kind of like what you're saying, is that they started out really solid. You know, they started out as like a really enjoyable game, and then you had the expansions on top of that to sort of add on.
Yeah. Or just play the expansions on their own because they were standalone games.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they could have potentially fixed the issues with an expansion, right? Because like they could have had like a Dark Crusade thing where like they completely changed the way the game functioned. But with how poor the release of Dawn of War 3 went, Relic closed, Dawn of War pretty much died, and now we wait for Total War Warhammer 40k. And hopefully that goes well. I mean, they've done well with the fantasy Warhammer, but we wait to see how 40k version of it goes. Otherwise, the next Space Hulk game, Space Hulk Deathwing Enhanced Edition specifically, it's the main one you'll actually be able to buy. But it, for me, from many technical aspects, it will go into okay. I think you could argue for it to go into worth playing, but the big thing about it is I think it's honestly a fairly solid experience. I think the single player can be actually enjoyable. You're playing as a librarian in Terminator armor in the Dark Angels Deathwing Terminator unit, going through a Space Hulk and trying to eliminate all the Tyranids from stealing genes once again, and trying to uncover the secrets of the Space Hulk itself. And it has some interesting aspects to that. The story is, followable. And I would actually love for us to play this together. But I will note the Russian Badger has a great video describing this game where it kind of is a tale of two games. The single player is kind of, a good once over experience, but gets kind of stale over time and repetitive. And playing as just the librarian can get a little old. And your NPC companions are not very helpful. But co-op with friends is actually super fun because you can play multiple classes. You can go through different versions of abilities and weapons and functions. But the game does suffer for some optimization issues, has weird difficulty spikes, but it's still a fun Dark Angels experience. And so overall, while I think it's potentially worth playing, I'm going to put it in okay. But if you're a big Dark Angels fan, especially a Deathwing fan, maybe it's in the worth playing. You could convince me.
Mm-hmm.
However, the epitome...
And this was a first-person shooter, right? This one?
Yes, here. This one is first person. So unlike the other one where it's like a tactical, a tactic game, this one is an FPS. And I think that helps a lot because the game itself, especially when you kind of you can get it dialed in so that it'll work on the computer, which I would say it actually runs better on current hardware. I think it was in the hardware when it came out. It just didn't mesh with it. But seemingly newer graphics cards seem to run it decently well enough. I haven't had too many issues since I've been playing it on and I have a 3060 Ti, so it's not by far the most powerful, but it's more modern. So I think that helps it. It seems to do better on more modern. But yeah. But next we're going to talk about the epitome of disappointment, and that is Warhammer 40k Eternal Crusade.
Oh.
It conceptually could go into heresy, and I think a lot of people would put it there. But it literally is like what disappointment is. This was supposed to be the 40k Battlefront. And in the very initial playtest, it was one of those things where it's like, it's like an alpha playtest. So like people who played it were like, this is an alpha, but the game seems to have a lot going for it. And I'm really excited for when it comes out. And then it all fell apart. The game released buggy as hell, barely worked, didn't look good, and just lost development and then shut down in 2021. So it lasted longer than it should have. I think it released in 2018, but it had so much promise and just failed in every aspect. Because that was the thing, right? Because it was a Battlefront type game. You could essentially play through with these characters and all that, and it was from multiple factions. Like you could run around the map as an Eldar, which was like really cool because that just isn't really a thing in a lot of these games, especially Eldar. So yeah, that sucks. There's like a fan mod that tried to tries to be like a fiction stuff like that, but I don't think a lot of people are going to be interested in doing that. I think it is a great concept and it would have worked if it just was cooked right.
Gotcha.
I'll tell you what's not a disappointment. And that is Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. An XCOM style game, and it just really hits it out of the park. Like,
You have my attention with XCOM.
yeah, I mean, look, this is straight up God Emperor tier potentially.
Wow.
Like, it's so
Okay.
it's
All right.
it's built. I mean, everything is thought out. So like one of the best touches is, and this is like such a minute detail, and this is my point to like epitomize how well thought out the game is by the developers. So the dialogue matches the Mechanicus Necrons very well. And one of the like subtle aspects about it is when you hear the voice acting, right? Because everything is still, no matter what, you'll get like a text bubble and stuff like that for dialogue. The Mechanicus speak generally with each other in lore, in a binary cant. And to us, it would kind of just sound like a mishmash of mechanical whirring and nonsense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the Necrons are fully voice acted in, for us, obviously, English. And so it hits this like duality of like the Mechanicus, fighting for humanity in this Necron tomb, but yet they don't even speak the language of the player. But the Necrons, who are these killer Terminator skeleton robots, do. So who's the real monster here? And the game plays on that. It's very good. And it's a great to give you a feeling of like how labyrinthian a Necron tomb works. And, it what I will note is it does one thing actually better than XCOM. And it's that it actually maybe doesn't have really bullshit point blank easy open melee misses. Sometimes it does, kind of, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as XCOM could get sometimes, at least like that first, I forget what year it came out, but like, and obviously XCOM was an original game, but I mean like the first reboot back in like, what was it, like 2011?
What enemy unknown?
Yeah.
That was, I'll pull it up right here. Enemy Unknown, that was 2012.
Yeah, okay.
You were close.
Yeah. So, yeah, it is also like the soundtrack for this game is such a banger. Like,
oh, yeah?
It's just worth listening to on its own, but it's like it works so
I love
well.
bangers.
It works so well. Like it fits the concept of how like you listen to it and you're like, this is shit that like the mechanic, this makes me think of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It's perfectly representative of them, and the game is just really great at like exemplifying them in multitudes of ways. It has great characters. It hits everything, and it is just universally loved. Which, it's hard to come down from that. But next is going to be Battle Sector, which is a tactical shooter, but a different type. Less XCOM and more just kind of standard turn-based tactics game. But it does play great for, the game that it is, right? It hits a good mix of having like the tabletop feel, right? Like it kind of has like a good feeling like it's, you're playing the tabletop game. You can play through a good number of the units, and like each unit is like a squad. So it like kind of properly fits to that experience. And I haven't played it like a crazy amount. I've definitely given it a shot, but I think it's definitely worth playing. I think the one thing that brings it down just a bit is the fact that like, if you want to get, it's one of those, again, modern era video gaming, you want to get the faction you potentially like, you might have to pay for it with DLC. So it's one of those things you have to keep in mind. But like many of the 40k games, it does go on sale pretty frequently. Like 40k and Star Wars are like one of the two series of games that I feel like very continually go on sale, like wholesale, like whole region of games are like always great when it's like seasonal sale time, because like there's whole catalog will go on sale. So it and its DLC might be a good time to do that. In those periods, but very much worth playing. Again, there's probably people who would put it up in amazing. I think I just brought it down mostly just because I do wish that there were more factions baseline. It's my like shake fist at the industry. The next up, we're gonna get more heresy time. You ready for more heresy?
Always.
Yeah.
Always.
What's really funny is the heresy is going to come at the expense of Battle Sister. Man, this game is trash. Man, VR is popular, right? Well, sadly, for the only dedicated Sisters of Battle video game, you get a buggy mess of a VR shooter that is just not good. Bad plot, bad game, just not even worth any function of the money it is. And the fact that this is the only game that's just dedicated game that sisters get, just heresy. It's just heresy.
That sucks.
But going back into our timing of blank but 40k game is the Diablo but 40k game in Inquisitor Martyr.
Oh, of course.
And I actually really like this game. I think it has a good gameplay loop. I think the Inquisitor types do have a good variety. The base game does have 3. It expands to more with DLC, but I think with the 3, I think you get a good concept of what is generally around with Inquisitors, in having essentially a heavy, like a heavy power armored guy, an assassin style, sniper, stealth, kind of stealth shooter, and then a psyker. And then it does expand to include a Mechanicus Inquisitor and a Sister of Battle. And I think they're adding a new one. I don't recall off the top of my head, but still. It gets good. It does get good support. The DLC, again, while it would seem like 3 would be small, it is one of those. I do think that was okay. Like, I think it launching with the 3 it did was actually okay, because they still felt different and not over each other's toes. And then the new classes, I think, just added, right? So it's the good type. And they're not very expensive add-ons either. So it helps itself out by having that, right? It's not like you're paying $30 for a DLC for a character class, right? The original, when the Mechanicus came out, I think it was more expensive, but it actually came with like new missions. So it was like a character and more game. And the game is decently long, so it has a lot of its benefit, but that is part of its downside, is that while it has a lot of missions and the story goes for a period of time, there is some repetitiveness, and that's a little bit of just what Diablo games kind of always run into. But that's the thing, right? You could be better, but it's not. So that's its main downside. And the gameplay loop can get a little stale at some point, I'm not a fan of the way if they want you to go through the crafting system. It's like weirdly, it like takes a weirdly long time to get to like craft better things. So it always just feels like you're constantly it's like just ignore the crafting and just wait until something better shows up in the story as you level up. Or you find it, right? Like, So it has its downsides. So it's not perfect by any means, but I still think it's worth playing. I think it's a very strong game. It's worth the go ahead on it. And if then you feel like you want to get, you want to play as a sister, you want to play as a Mechanicus, then you can do so and you'll still get a good time out of it. But it is not without fault. And potentially those could be game breaking faults for some people, but not for me. So they're not breaking for me. So I think it's worth a play. And I brought it down for more of the general sense. Okay. So orc games, it feels like with the two main ones that are kind of out, they're either a good or a bad experience. And starting with the bad, Daka Squadron is a not rogue squadron reborn. And again, in that category of blank game, but 40k, this was trying to be Rogue Squadron, but Daka Squadron. See the name? It is instead, though, a boring mess that isn't well supported anymore and has essentially been abandoned by the player base. So you're not going to get into any multiplayer games, and it looks like it could have promise, but I guess with the lack of support from devs and the bugs I guess it had either at one point or still does, it just is a disappointment. It was technically at least kind of playable at one point. So
yeah,
it's not heresy, but it's not good. It's not worth looking at. However, Blood, Shooters, and Teeth is the opposite. It's actually a really fun experience. It has amazing humor. It follows the story of playing an orc who had their hair squig taken by their stupid boss. So, you go through and you shoot up through a bunch of things and, get revenge on the boss. And it's great the first playthrough. It doesn't hold an amazing level of replayability, but it is still crazy fun, crazy funny. Like it had on its own as a game, especially it is still just very good in many respects. The multiplayer has multiplayer. It's kind of funky. I don't know if they've fixed it since earlier and they're close to its launch. But it has some of the funniest and perfect representation for the silliness of 40k. So it's in some regards, it's probably better to play if you know about 40k, because it's not going to teach you a lot about 40k, but it's great to make fun of 40k for those who know about it. So
gotcha.
In some respects, because it's a play once game, I'm going to put it in okay, the toppest level of okay, but it is technically still worth playing, especially on sale. But it's it kind of is just a play once type game, but still super funny and will be a good time. I don't want to say people to think that it's in the okay because it's bad, right? It's the mid doesn't equal bad argument, right? That we have to remember sometimes.
Certainly.
But yeah. But one kind of a example, but I would say honestly is also a must play. Actually, before that, we're going to talk about Gladiates, Civilization, but 40k. It isn't as technically probably complete or good as Civilization, but it's still itself an amazing 40k game. You can get through a number of factions. It gets a lot of support. It still gets updates and add-ons. I know there are mods to help give more options for faction subtypes, like different Space Marines. But the downside of it is most of the factions are locked behind paid DLC, which, we talked about this with Battle Sector, but I think it's actually worse a little bit with Gladius. But I think Gladius is actually still on its own, base game, all that, a better game than Battle Sector. Like, I think it has a lot more completeness. I think it being a civilization game is actually really works for the world of 40K. And like the combat itself has like a really good way of like, you know, go through everything, play it like a proper Civ game, and you'll still get a good challenge, but it's not impossible. But I'm going to put it, you know, I'm going to knock it down from being in the, you know, from being in the God Emperor tier where it could be into amazing, because I've, you know, more factions, less DLC, right? Or less paid DLC, right? That whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it just gets knocked down because of that. All right. However, another very much, I would say, you know, must play. This will probably be controversial for some people. So I'm going to put this in amazing, and that's going to be Darktide. And the reason is it launched a little bit rough, a little bit less to be desired from a lot of people's perspectives. But I don't know why. And I think, again, it's one of those things where I think a lot of times happens in games in recency of like weird or like expectations being different, I think, than even what's being offered, right? Like, this isn't a scenario of like they pledged more than they gave. Like, I think it's partly just like that people were expecting more than what it was giving. And now, granted, I think part of that could come from, you know, this is the same dev who made Vermintide, you know, and Vermintide 2, right? Very well-liked games. And I played them a bit, but like, and like, I know they have a character progression system, but, you know, I never looked at the game and thought Vermintide is super deep. I always just looked at it and this is fantasy Left 4 Dead. And so I thought Darktide would be Left 4 Dead, but 40K, right? But
that's what I hoped for, yeah.
Yeah, and that's all I expected. So when it launched and it was essentially just Left 4 Dead, but 40K, and it had some ability aspects to it, I was like, cool, great with me. Just what I wanted. No problems. You know, it had some, you know, like optimization things when it first launched, but those got like ironed out within like a day or two. So like that was just like, you know, oh, we thought we had this, but we didn't. Here you go. So like days later it was fixed. But like, yeah, it was just like, I think it was mostly a netcode thing actually.
Does this one have microtransactions in it?
Yes, but they're all cosmetic.
Okay.
So like they're there. You do not need to do them in any way. They're not forced on you. They're just skins. So like, you know, it's obviously like the questionable ethical aspect of it. But like, honestly, even if it's a paid game, I don't care if they have a microtransaction as long as it's just the cosmetic shit, right? Like if it's just skins, then I don't care. If people want to, you know, if people are going to get dangled by like, ooh, this one has a pretty piece of armor. Like at that point, I will kind of put it in like a little bit of a, all right, that's on you for maybe a little bit of lack of self-control here. But, you know, people love to dress up their online avatars. So it is what it is. But I don't think it's egregious. You know, it doesn't get shoved in your face a whole lot either, which is actually really nice. They'll just like make a post like on because Darktide has like a launch splash thing. It'll like show up as part of like, it'll show up as like a news article. Like they'll have like, here's the here's the new deal. Here's the new or here's the new patch. Here's what the patch is adding. And then here's the new thing we have. And this is actually why I think I give a huge pass to the cosmetics. Is cosmetics and whatnot are, those are microtransactions, but all the expansions, so the new patches that added new missions, new story and all that, those have been free. So like
that's good.
Yeah, like giving more actual game has been free for the initial amount you paid. It's just the shit that doesn't actually matter to the game that you can pay real money for if you want. So I think they do a good job of it. It is obviously still partly in that modern game, whatever, right? But I think it's the best way that it could exist in this modern, format.
So this is made by Fat Shark. This is in the vein of Vermintide. I'm familiar with Vermintide.
Yeah.
I have been. I've spent years really trying to find something that like fills that Left 4 Dead void, because Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2 are like some of my favorite games of all time. But a lot of the games that have come out that are like trying to be that, even ones like made by like Turtle Rock Studios, nothing's been able to really like capture that spark for me. If I go into this like trying to find something that's going to give me the exact feeling that Left 4 Dead did, am I setting myself up for disappointment by doing that? Like, is it different enough that I shouldn't go in with that expectation?
I think so. I think the one thing that's going to be tough about trying to find a pure Left 4 Dead replacement is just the fact that like finding something that like Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2 just had like the perfect mix of like the way it was like serious and silly, and Warhammer and Darktide has a little bit of silliness in it, right? It has comedic points in it, but like, like it was also like, Left 4 Dead also had a good balance then of having good gameplay, like being arcadey, but not too arcadey. Like there was kind of all these functions to it. And so it depends on what you really liked from Left 4 Dead 2 and what you attach to, that you would maybe like something like Vermintide or Darktide. So that's where the question kind of comes in. All in all, I think it's worth playing. Again, Darktide also available on Game Pass, so could be helpful for some people. But again, I would say like it's hard to say that it would necessarily fill your Left 4 Dead itch, because it depends on what about Left 4 Dead is hits that itch.
Yeah, certainly.
But I will note, voice acting is like one of the best parts about Darktide. Like the voice acting and lines are just supreme.
That's good, because that's a huge thing that gave the Left 4 Dead games their personality, was the characters, honestly, and like the voice acting between them.
That's fairly true about any 40k game, especially in the like the more modern era. Like just voice acting has been so good for so long.
Yeah.
But next we're going to get to the second mobile game of the list. And if you've looked up anything at 40k, then you've probably gotten an ad for this game. And that is Tacticus. And
I've heard that name.
Yeah. Honestly, I expected it to end up kind of similar to Freeblade. I figured it'd be filled with ads, microtransactions, and it would be almost unplayable for free. And I was for sure wrong, right? I was wrong. Not completely, though. It still has its mobile games, right? But it sits kind of around where I would want a mobile game to live in, right? Where I can play the game for free and I can get characters and all this stuff eventually. And if I want to pay and get the characters I want or the factions I want now, the option's there. But I can still go at my leisure. It does have the downside of kind of using like a loot box system to try to give you the materials to unlock those things. But like, I've barely gone through the first campaign, and there's multiple campaigns in the game at this point. So like, there's so many routes that I could end up unlocking a bunch of the factions and things like that I haven't reached them yet, you know? So like, you know, it's not like I've played the game for like supreme numbers of hours. I actually wanted to try this game out for this, and I would just kind of do it between stuff at work or like maybe just before I go to bed or something. So like, I've only got like a couple hours maybe total in it. And like I said, it's, you know, so like, I wouldn't expect, you know, you're not going to get every single playable faction in the game within that period of time, but it seems to do it in a reasonable amount, and it makes it so that the microtransactions kind of do what I think mobile games could do, which is like, all right, the game is free, but if you want to essentially like have everything available from the get-go, then you can pay for it. You know, it's open. Otherwise, just go through the game as it was kind of designed, and then eventually unlock stuff. But again, it's still got some gotcha component, so it is what it is in that aspect. But the game itself is okay. Like, it's a tactical game. It's a mobile tactical game. Kind of plays somewhat similar to Fire Emblem Heroes. And that it's a very gotcha game, but I do like the abilities and stuff. And I think it goes by a little bit faster and nicer than Fire Emblem Heroes. So I'll definitely put it in the okay tier. It's honestly, if you're willing to do it, I think sure. If you are into it, I think it's fine. I wouldn't judge you negatively if you told me you played this. But if you want to skip it, go ahead. All right, so we're going to get into some recent releases. So one of them being Chaos Gate Demon Hunters. Now, this I'm going to put into the worth playing category. And it's for a couple of reasons. You know, it is still a decent Grey Knights experience. It is technically actually a remake of a really old game. But it falls prey in the aspect that, you know, first it's kind of like it's like the aspect of like a simple enemy can technically still incapacitate a Grey Knight because, you know, video game health bar system. Mm-hmm. But that's just inherently also part of it having video game aspects, right? Hard to avoid that completely. But, you know, so it can get a little bit of a pass because as you go progress through the game, right, you just don't see those enemies as much. You know, but it is still, on its basis, it's a turn-based tactical game. And, you know, with the way that the number of characters that are available versus the enemies that you are going against, like unlike Darktide, like in Darktide, you know, you're 4 random ass humans fighting against hordes of Nurgle demons and zombies. Like, you would be so dead. Like, the diseases you would immediately contract by being in that war zone. Mm-hmm. Like, you would be so dead. But the Grey Knights, being a few Grey Knights fighting a large number of demons and, you know, demons and whatnot, makes sense in the lore, right? So from that part, it does fit that much nicer. But the reviews, I will note, kind of do seem to have it fall off on some of the other lore tidbits, and it seems to plateau on its pacing. And recently, they've supposedly changed the balance of the game a bit, so it doesn't feel like it is on par with maybe where the difficulty should be. So that part you can maybe take a grain of salt, but I think especially if you like Grey Knights or if you like the tactical games in 40k, it probably is worth a playthrough. Otherwise, you know, I feel like a game that is kind of like weirdly flickered and somewhat recency is Bolt Gun. So I'm going to tentatively put it in the worth playing, but I have a reason why. All right.
I love this game. I have played a bunch of Bolt Gun. It is the game that made me go, hey, it'd be kind of cool to dive into what 40k is actually about someday. Oh well, back to playing more Bolt Gun. I love this game.
And that, you know what? And I do too. I very much do too. And I have a good reason why I'm putting it a little bit low. And that is that first, the game is obviously simple enough. It's a very easy entry. You can play it.
It is the boomeriest of boomer shooters.
Exactly. And I mean, you can play the game, know nothing about Warhammer 40k lore, and have a good time. But that's the thing, right? That's kind of where it falters in some aspects. First of all, one of the things I do somewhat look gameplay wise that is a little bit more of an unfortunate aspect is that essentially at some point the game stops throwing new things at you. Like the bosses are repeat of previously.
That's true.
The weapons are you've gotten all the weapons by that point. You know, like it's kind of like by Act 3, you've seen everything. Minus the actual final boss. Granted, all those weapons, enemies, and levels are awesome. But like it just like essentially by halfway through Act 2, you've effectively seen all of the game. It's just the puzzles are different. Those puzzles are good,
and also,
but you know,
it's also worth acknowledging that like I like the levels, but there's a very common criticism levied at this game that I think is pretty fair, which is that it's kind of easy to get lost in them. At times they can get kind of like labyrinthine or just like really not. They're designed in such a way that's not very intuitive to kind of move through, and it can be really easy to kind of get lost, you know, and kind of end up backtracking by accident or feeling like you need to in order to figure out where you need to go next. They did just release an expansion for this game that includes like sort of an updated navigational system that kind of helps out with that, and it's great.
Yes,
but yeah, definitely worth acknowledging that was kind of like a big problem with this game initially.
Yeah, very much so. And then I had to still downgrade it for some of the lore issues. And a great example is you are one Marine.
Yes.
And you fight not one, not two, but even 3 Lords of Change. Like the greater demon that is essentially just below the chaos god Tzeentch. Champion of Tzeentch. And you fight and kill multiple of them. Granted, you are an Ultramarine, which means you get Ultramarine plot armor. And it's great for the game itself. But as a podcast that is judging these things, especially based on, you know, using them for lore benefits, it has to be downgraded for it. And this also includes even the great unclean ones that you also fight. Also, have you played through the whole thing?
Yeah, I've played through the whole thing. It's doing something even I know, like from with my like limited experience with Warhammer lore prior to starting this podcast. Like I even knew just playing through it, I could tell it was like there's definitely a level of like, you know, fighting game dream match type scenario going on where it's definitely like they're not worrying about the fact that you're just like a single Marine and they want to put you up against as many of these like super cool units as possible, even if it wouldn't make sense for you to be able to take them on just by yourself. Correct. Like it's definitely like it feels like you're playing a power fantasy that even excels upon what you would normally expect a Space Marine or an Ultramarine to be able to accomplish.
Yeah. Also, like the fact that somewhat spoilers that the final boss is a Chaos Space Marine sorcerer summoning a great unclean one and Lord of Change. Like a Chaos Space Marine summoner or sorcerer would try to summon one of those greater demons, and those greater demons would immediately curb stomp the shit out of that sorcerer, and then fight this, and then fight the Space Marine that you are playing as. Like, they would not listen to that Chaos Space Marine at all.
It's definitely a thing of like I say, it's like a dream match. It's just like, what's the coolest like fan fiction-y, sandbox type thing that would be like, oh man, it'd be so cool if this showed up and then suddenly it was able to do this and then that, and they're just like, let's just put it in there to be fun as opposed to being like accurate to 40k lore.
Right. And so finally, we're going to talk about the newest 40k game release in Rogue Trader. So there's a couple things I know a number of people are dealing with when they play this game. First, it is not Baldur's Gate 3, but 40k. It is Pathfinder Kingmaker, but 40k. It is by those people, and it plays like those games.
Sure.
It is also 40k, remember. So, and it does attempt to be quite lore accurate. This has the benefit as playing a rogue trader. This means that you effectively are, while a noble, you are a noble that gets to be above the law. The only person that you really have to listen to is an inquisitor. And in some respects, that's a maybe. So this means, unlike Baldur's Gate, that there will also be greater negative consequences to a number of your decisions. So while this might lead to some positives, like if you are to act heretical, for example, you might get some power, but it also means that some things will just straight up kill you. And you will not be able to romance everyone. Look, we all want to Riz the Battle Sister or the Space Wolf. But it just won't happen. Both of those. Yeah, unfortunately, both a Space Wolf and a Sister of Battle are generally going to be celibate. One because of genetic things, the other because of piety. Those were not respective in the way I described those. But yeah, like I said, like this game is also fairly accurate based on the Rogue Trader TTRPG, which is quite unforgiving. It's a D100 based system. The game operates kind of on that. And that's the thing, right? So like when you're starting early on, and if you're playing it on like the TTRPG based difficulty, which is not normal, it's the one above it. Like essentially it's the way the game works. It's like you have a ballistic skill characteristic, which is your shooting skill, maybe starting with a 45. So that means you need to roll a 45 or below on a D100 to actually hit your target. So especially early on, you were given a quite significant, higher chance of failure. It is a straight up 45% chance to hit. Where maybe in something like D&D, you might actually start with a 65 or a 70% chance to hit, even at low level. In some instances. So yes, this is not Baldur's Gate where you can sex the whole party. And while character-wise, you may face certain force consequences, you still do have a lot of freedom in knowing that you are a rogue trader. And, you have just about as much authority as an inquisitor. And you can get a good amount of character freedom and development. Like the class build tree is super widespread. It's really easy to also reset your character. So you can, and any of your characters. So all of your party members and whatnot. But it really does capture the TTRPG feel and the lore atmosphere. So I think it's a must play. I think despite its faults, I think it does belong in the amazing tier. It may not be for everyone though. I will absolutely acknowledge this. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I think it's very much like, I think it's a great setup. I think they've done a great job. You know, Owlcat did awesome. I think it was very tough for it to come out after Baldur's Gate, and I think that hurt its perspective for a lot of people. But all in all, I think it's a must play for sure. And that's it. That's all the games that I've got for you.
Uh-huh.
If there's other games that you find out there, either know nothing about it or just don't worry about it. That's what I'm gonna live with as my notes for people.
If you know of a game in the Warhammer 40k universe that did not get mentioned on this list, but that you do think is worth mentioning or interested in, let us know in the comments below. Let us know about your obscure 40k game that you love,
or really old 40k game because you're a boomer.
Yeah,
if it's on a floppy 40k,
if it's on a floppy disk, I want to hear about it. I want to hear about that stuff.
There definitely aren't any boomers that play 40k regularly and complain about it. But yeah, I think there are a number of titles that could obviously get moved up or down depending on people's feels or whatnot. But this is kind of my relatively subjectively objective outlook at these games.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, Bolt Gun could move up. Blood Shooters and Teeth could move up. You know, some of them could move down. I think some people would potentially move Chaos Gate and Inquisitor down. Some people would move Dark Tide down. But again, thing of expectations. I think if you expect it to be more of like not a supremely deep game, it is just a horde game where you're going to fight a bunch of plague zombies and Nurgle demons as 4 ex-cons, then you're fine. You'll be fine. But yeah, any of these games that you have any extra questions or thoughts on?
So, like I mentioned before, I did start Dawn of War 2. Mm-hmm. And I intend to continue through the campaign on that because that first mission I played was extremely well laid out and it was really fun. Had a great time with that. Obviously, I'm going to continue to, play Bolt Gun on and off because even though I've beaten it once, it is just like I mean, I really like boomer shooters in general, if that's not been made clear. And Bolt Gun, it's just like a really enjoyable, fun game. Like you're right, it is super light on the lore, and it's not exactly concerning itself with that so much as it is just like the feeling of being a space marine cutting through hordes. But it's really fun, and I'm probably going to keep playing that, and of course that new expansion that just came out as well. I am definitely going to play Space Marine because I've been following Space Marine 2 and all the coverage that's been getting before its release, and it looks fantastic. So I definitely want to touch the original Space Marine to kind of, get a sense of what the hype is all about, and prepare myself for Space Marine 2 when it comes out this year. I'm trying to think if there's any other ones. Rogue Trader is like, because I like Owlcat as a studio, so Rogue Trader has definitely been on my kind of view as like one of these days I want to get around to that. It's just not like as much of like an urgent need to play it as soon as possible. But with your recommendation, like it definitely, that definitely bumps it up. It makes it that like, I definitely need to consider playing that one. And yeah, Dark Tide, you said, is on Game Pass. Like I'll absolutely grab that on Game Pass and see how it plays, how it feels. Cause yeah, like I say, I'm always any of those like multiplayer shooters like that. I haven't found one that quite snatches the crown from Left 4 Dead for me, but that doesn't mean I'm not willing to, still try them out and see how they feel. So,
yeah, I think a good thing about, or a big thing about, what was it getting? The thing with Space Marine is obviously the fact that like it was made by Relic, like that first one, so which obviously doesn't exist anymore and is not making the second one. So
correct.
Obviously, like the whole thought and process is that they are going to be making that, like Space Marine 2 will be an improvement in every function, but it is still worth playing where I put it. So But yeah, no, I think obviously, yeah, it's kind of like any games are always going to be just like whenever you always feel like it, but there's definitely plenty out there to go through, and it's definitely still going to be a good time, and plenty of, honestly, especially lately, plenty of great newer games out there of 40k to play, and there are still older ones that do hold up, which is always, I think, a good thing to have a decent number of them that do that. But that'll be it for this episode. We'll come back next week, and we'll be back on our normal lore shit. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and or listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.